Jake Fischer, senior NBA reporter for Yahoo. Good morning. Thanks for doing this, man.
How you guys doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm good, dude. So yeah, we're quickly approaching Friday. I think is the time where we get to see the NBA is weird, right? We get now you can sign with a team, but it's not official for a few days thing. But we open up on Friday. I'm going to start with a few little Raptors pieces before we move into some greater NBA stuff. Because yesterday it comes down that OG Anunoby is leaving Clutch Sports, which feels a little odd considering Clutch's power in the league. What does this mean, if anything, to you?
I want to use my words carefully because I know that the Raptors fan base and Twitter army has been very sensitive about my OG Anunoby reporting lately. But I'll say, like, he's definitely been taking meetings with other representation for several weeks now. And I've seen in those conversations with potential new representation has been how to play his situation, in that he's got, his contract expiring next summer. He is extension eligible, and these new rules now allow you to get a little bit more money than previously. But at the same time, with all this looming, potential of will Fred VanVleet stay or go, Pascal Siakam's name back up in trade talks, like for OG Anunoby to stick around in Toronto and be content and happy, he still does want a bigger role than has been provided to him on offense in past seasons. So from my understanding, he kind of has been seeking counsel from other areas outside of Clutch Sports to figure out exactly how to navigate his position moving forward. I don't know what his conclusion is yet. I haven't heard he's actually or I haven't heard which agency he's pinpointed. So that could suggest also what pathway he'll choose. But that's really all I have to kind of provide some context there.
Well, don't worry about Raptors Twitter, all right? There's nothing you can do. There's nothing any of us can do other than unless you tweet the Raptors are the GOAT. That's it. That's the only tweet that works, that people are like, yes, thank you for this. We will not push back at all. Or actually, this is a good one for you if you ever want to ingratiate yourself. Just say the Raptors don't get enough respect as an organization, and then you'll basically get, I would say, at least a couple of weeks of reprieve from angry Raptors Twitter. It's interesting, though, because, you leave your management. That is usually a sign of, hey, I'm not happy with things. And you go, okay, you're not happy with things. You're here in Toronto. And we've heard that for a while now. This is nothing new. I remember talking to Windhorst a full year ago where he was talking about the initial round of Portland rumors, right? What ended up being the Shaedon Sharpe pick of, hey, listen, he wants more. He wants a greater role. And at some point, if you're in this whole mix of, hey, run it all back, bring everybody back, and now you're adding a first-round pick and Grady Dick, who you would assume is going to be someone that plays right away, it does come down to more than just the money. It does come down to the role. And we've been sort of sold this idea that OG Anunoby really cares about Toronto, or that, he Masai, that there's some kind of connection with these two. But if we do see a scenario where Fred VanVleet re-signs, do you think that makes it more likely he stays, or more likely that he's actually one of the guys that they start to shop? Because they have to move money, and they also have to satisfy the rest of the parties with, the touches.
So entering draft week, the word around the league, and this is from, rival teams getting the impression after all the Raptors trade conversations, team after team was telling me that the Raptors were at least giving off the impression that Pascal was the player they were hoping to move the most. And the Hawks were the one team that I really was hearing consistently. There were some whispers about the Rockets, but I think that stuff might have faded after James Harden's potential reunion has seemed to fade there too. The word there has also been that Siakam, him facing a potential lucrative extension here this summer, he doesn't really have a big appetite to move elsewhere either. So there's been some back channel signaling going on about whether or not he'd be willing to sign an extension in certain places. So I think with all that being said, to your point, if one or Fred or Pascal isn't out of the Raptors equation, this is just me connecting all the dots. I don't want to speak for OG Anunoby directly here, but I would be surprised if both those guys are back, that with the addition of Grady Dick, like you're saying, there still continues to be the thought that the Raptors want to move Scotty Barnes into more and more ball handling opportunities, similar to Siakam has had over the past couple of seasons. It would be difficult to see OG Anunoby back in Toronto with like a huge smile on his face about being, the fourth banana again to Scotty and Fred and Pascal. So, yeah, I do think those are connected to some degree. It's early. Tuesday before free agency starting Friday is like an eternity, so a lot can happen here. I don't really know exactly how it will all play out, but the likelihood right now of one of those guys heading out the door at this juncture, it would seem like Fred VanVleet to Houston is probably the strongest possibility of either of those two guys leaving the Raptors.
Well, yeah, Houston just has an insane amount of cap space, and to the point where they're just linked to everybody, right? Like, it's just where anyone could land? Houston, because they have all this cap.
Yeah.
So James Harden doesn't look like it's going to happen. That puts is Fred VanVleet Houston's number one target?
I believe so. I think they've got like a tiered ranking system where Austin Reeves is involved, and I don't really think Kyrie Irving is necessarily in play for them. But Austin Reeves, Fred VanVleet, I've heard a bit of D'Angelo Russell, Gabe Vincent. I could see being an option for them as well.
If Fred does leave for Houston, is it because a number just happens that Toronto can't match, or is it because, he's looking for a new opportunity? Like, where are you at in terms of what Fred's priorities are in free agency?
I think money is going to be a massive factor for him in that undrafted guy who has made a hell of a living for himself, but you go back to entering the league as an older player on a rookie minimum type contract, his earning potential has been dramatically lower than what it would have been if he was a first round pick on, a hot premium route to get a big second contract off these rookie scale deals. Just name any single guy, right? Like Cam Johnson's about to get a 4-year, $100 million deal at like a minimum, it sounds like. That's something that, Fred couldn't get till his third contract. So I think, it's been pretty clearly characterized to me, dating back to when he had his old representation at Parlay before he left to join Clutch, that he wants to be compensated like one of the best point guards in the league. And looking at Jalen Brunson sign a massive $100 million deal wasn't exactly an easy pill to swallow last year. So I do think, if he can get to Houston on like a 2-year max or a 1+1 where he can just cash in, a huge payday and then potentially get back out into the market next year or in 2 years, be up for another big deal before he's exited his prime, that does seem like a pretty plausible scenario for him.
Yeah, it just makes it seem harder and harder for Toronto for a lot of the reasons that we've been kind of talking about, which is they do have a bit of a roster imbalance in terms of trying to figure out who's going to end up being, the end of game guy or who's going to be where on the hierarchy. They've got their own tax situation that they're going to have to worry about. And with taxes, I hate to be so cliche with this, but it's going to be hard to match Houston given that they have so much money, but also a tax rate that's far more competitive than Toronto's. Like if this is all about money for him, or at least in, as the main portion of this, it makes it harder and harder for me to understand what Toronto's offer to Fred VanVleet is going to be that's going to make sense for him. Do you think Toronto would do a similar thing, though, like that you're outlining, which is, hey, you get the 1+1 or the 2-year big max contract, but not go on term? Or do you think that the Raptors would want to have him locked into a longer deal?
So I do think there's absolutely still opportunity for him to stick around, and someone familiar with Fred's thinking told me that as much yesterday. The number that, it's been written in other outlets as well that I keep hearing that the Raptors know they're going to have to surpass is 390. So are we looking at, 3/120? That'd be, to your point about getting that number, I feel like that might be a little rich for Toronto's blood. I don't know the cap that they're willing to go, but I think that the Raptors, from all accounts, are very much of the understanding they're going to have to exceed $30 million in average annual value to keep Fred around.
For those who, quick math, 3/120 is 40 a year. That's That's a lot for Fred VanVleet. That's going to be met with some interesting opinions, I would say, if it gets into that number. Okay, so if Fred does leave, if he does leave, it puts Toronto in a weird position where like they don't have a ton of salary cap space, but also they desperately need a point guard, even if they do try to sell Scotty Barnes as the guy. Is there a name out there that you think that they're linked to? Like D'Angelo Russell is working out in Toronto, which is a bit of an oddity. I haven't been able to figure out as to why he's doing that. But, yeah, do you read anything into a situation like that? Or are there any point guards you think Toronto would target if he does end up leaving?
I don't read into where guys work out. Like I forget who the player is off the top of my head, but there's someone working out in Cleveland right now, like at the Cavs facilities, who's not a Cavs player, but just because like he's a local guy. It might be Larry Nance off the top of my head. But it doesn't really matter. Just to say, like, local Philly guys go work out at the Sixers practice facility. Mm-hmm. There's no local ties to D'Lo in Toronto. So to your point, I don't really know what's happening there, but I wouldn't necessarily read into it. I think, other targets for the Raptors, I mean, right now, the large majority of Raptors conversation has been, what are they going to do about retaining Fred? And if they do lose him, will there be some potential sign and trade opportunity to get him somewhere outside of Houston? Because any other suitor pretty much, the Orlando stuff I think has pretty much died out, even though I do think there was real possibilities there at a point in time. But then Markelle Fultz had a good year. Cole Anthony's had a good year. They drafted another point guard, Anthony Black. To get him to the Lakers or another winning situation, they're going to have to find a sign and trade. Maybe that is D'Lo trying to be in the radar and show himself and say, I would be in Toronto, take me back in a sign and trade type thing. I don't know. The other conversation about the Raptors, though, has just been about Jakob Poeltl. And look, when you give up a first-round pick for someone at the trade deadline as their expiring contract, usually you have an idea of the ballpark range salary that they're looking to achieve there. I had heard some rumblings that maybe that wasn't as obvious of a reunion or as a return as it seemed on paper, but as we get closer this week, it does seem like Poeltl will be back somewhere around $20 million, and that's been his asking price pretty much all year that was floated around to potential teams that were going to trade for him.
Yeah, so what we're talking about right now is potentially $60 million a year for Fred VanVleet and Jakob Poeltl. So, yeah.
And to be clear, I don't think the Raptors are going to go up that high. I think that's, the upward ballpark, but
that's this is done today deal, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the negotiation is over. We're floating you $40 million a season, Fred. And he's like, yep, don't worry, I'm here. There's no more flirting with any other place. I'm a Toronto Raptor. I'm a very happy Toronto Raptor. Either way, do you feel like, at least so Poeltl Raptors feel like heavy favorites, and they have to be like the optics of losing a first and then having Poeltl walk, like some people we had on the show last week talking about his potential to go back to San Antonio with Mark Stein, and I went, I don't think that there could be anything more embarrassing than that happening to Toronto. San Antonio winning the lottery in a year where people wish that they tanked, getting a first-round pick from the Raptors, and then signing Poeltl. It almost gets the Kawhi trade done. It's like that's nothing happened between these two organizations. But do you view the Fred thing then as just pretty much, hey, it's down to Houston and Toronto?
That is probably an oversimplification, but yeah, in my mind, those are the only real options I'm connecting for him on the board right now.
So the other part of it that you mentioned is the Siakam stuff, and yeah, you've had him linked to Atlanta. Do you think that the John Collins trade, which finally happens after years and years and years of speculation, does that make a Hawks Siakam trade more or less likely?
It's hard to piece together because the Hawks are doing and talking about so many different things that a lot of them are counterintuitive to each other. And that's not to say that the Hawks are all over the place and they're not doing a good job. I just think they have a lot of different balls in the air that it's kind of hard to draw a straight line through what they're trying to achieve. At this point, it does seem like DeJounte Murray is more than likely headed back to the Hawks on an extension. Moving Collins' money will give them both playing time for Sadiq Ben and Onyeka Okongwu, but also the opportunity to come to extensions with those guys. And DeJounte was, I don't know what the Raptors' interest in him was, but he was at least the name that I believe was involved in trade talks for Siakam with Toronto. But all indications are that Siakam has, at least with the Hawks and maybe even around the league, indicated he's not really thrilled about signing an extension outside of Toronto. So I don't know what the viability of him being dealt to Atlanta really is because of that. And also, with all these cost-saving moves that the Hawks are considering, with moving DeAndre Hunter potentially to Indiana or Detroit, or just like they did with John Collins, it doesn't necessarily make sense to go trade for someone who's past 30 or, exiting his prime, who's going to be commanding a max contract over $40 million. They got this big trade exception out of the Collins deal, but bringing on Siakam just doesn't seem to mesh with the other things on their board right now.
Yeah. The only thing about Siakam making it essentially public that he wants to sign in Toronto, which again makes sense. He's lives here. He makes a ton of money here. I know that there's a lot of Raptors fans still going, this is so refreshing, and finally someone wants to be here. I'm like, well, other guys did want to be here. DeRozan wanted to be here. This isn't completely unprecedented. But yeah, he gets more money if he's here too. But how could this not affect his position from a leverage standpoint with the Raptors? Like, if he's saying he's not willing to go somewhere else because he really wants to sign the extension here, like, yeah, how does that not affect his leverage when it comes to an extension?
I see your point. I mean, a lot of the logic that teams and players and representation use at this time of year is something I can't explain. And, I'm not saying they're handling this the wrong way, but everyone's got their own motivations. Everyone's got their own finger on the pulse, and sometimes they know things that we don't. Like, oh, well, if we just continue to do this, then this will happen here and that'll happen there. So I never try to really explain or dissect the calculus of what certain, positionings are in terms of leverage and negotiating stuff, because I've never actually been in a room, right, where we're trying to talk dollars and cents or trying to make a deal happen. And, we don't always know all the options that are on the board. So I always try to kind of reserve judgment in those scenarios.
Okay, so are we done with Damian Lillard stuff? Is it resolved now after he and Joe Cronin met, and the statement goes, I met with Dame and Aaron Goodwin this afternoon. We had a great dialogue. We remain committed to building a winner around Dame, end quote. Are we done?
We're not done, but I'll tell you, the way the Raptors, or the Blazers, are handling the Dame situation is very similar, even though they're very different in that Dame has not requested a trade yet. But it's really analogous to how the Nets handled Kevin Durant's trade request about an hour before free agency dropped last year, where Brooklyn kind of looked around and said, look, dude, you're on a 4-year contract. We don't have to trade you. We're going to keep making moves. We're going to try to build out a contender around you, keep you happy, and we'll hope you'll change your mind, which is what Durant ended up doing. And they kept him around for 6 more months before Kyrie's contract thing kind of blew that whole thing up. And then they end up tearing apart their team at the deadline. The Blazers are going to see an approach. I think this is exactly what they told Dame in that meeting. This is what they've kind of been projecting around the league, dating back to the pre-draft stuff, that even if they didn't trade the number 3 pick, they had plans to re-sign Jeremy Grant, and there's other moves they're going to try to make in free agency, whether that's with trade or what other sign and trade creativity that they can come up with. They're looking at this as a multi-week window to try to show Dame that they can build a team around him that can compete for a championship. But does that mean come July 15th, when Summer League's winding down and I'm flying home ready for a vacation, that he could request out, or Portland could decide we got to move him, just like Utah all of a sudden reversed course on Donovan Mitchell last year? I'm definitely prepared for that scenario mentally. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess. Yeah. Obviously, he's not. He's a infinitely more important player than Jordan Poole. But, we did get that quote from Dunleavy a couple of days ago where he was, he's very important. We plan for him to be here till the end of the contract. And then, he's dealt, 24 hours later, 48 hours later, somewhere in that ballpark. So I don't know. I guess I don't really want to be doing the Dame rumors all summer if there is really a desire to keep him there. It's really hard to see what you mentioned there, which is how they build this winner around him, how things materially change unless they're willing to move off of some of those young guys, which, I don't really see that happening either. Okay, so a guy that I can't stop thinking about because he's Canadian and he's wild card is Dylan Brooks. Because what?
Yeah.
Okay, he's clearly at least good, right? Can we just say he's decent? He's fine. Yes. Like, and it feels like he's probably is he going to go under market value? Is someone going to get a bargain on him? What is Dillon Brooks's value to you right now?
By all accounts, he is very likely going to be headed to Houston. I don't know value in terms. Yeah, I don't know, but him, Fred VanVleet, and Brook Lopez, through all the noise, those have been the most consistent names, and it's also been communicated to me pretty clearly that the Rockets are looking at. They want one point guard, they want one veteran point guard, they want one veteran wing player, and they want one veteran center. So those seem to be like across the board the top three choices, or their top choices at those three spots. So with Brooks, I mean, Detroit was supposed to be a potential opportunity for him. I don't see that anymore. They're getting linked to Cam Johnson, Draymond Green, and DeAndre Hunter, and I mean, the board right now for agency is kind of crowded. Not just Houston. Like that's kind of my story that should be coming out in the next hour or so. With Yahoo's kind of touch on that. But there's all these ripple effects and domino effects, just like every summer. But the Pacers can't bring in every single power forward to their starting lineup too.
Mm-hmm.
So to bring it back to Brooks, Houston does seem like the place for him. The value of him, to your question, I would expect he gets somewhere around $15 million in average annual salary, like give or take a couple million. But I really don't have as clear of an answer on that number figure as like with Fred. I've been told pretty unequivocally for him to go there, it's going to take the full 2-year $80 million max.
It's interesting with Brook Lopez because, I understand why Houston would want him if they're trying to, vaunt into being a winner, and he was amazing last season. But, he's 35 years old. And at least when Milwaukee lost to me, I kept thinking, okay, well, they're probably going to be able to run this back, and that's the only thing that they're going to end up doing. And now all of a sudden, maybe he departs. Chris Middleton, obviously a free agent. They got Joe Ingles, who's a free agent. What's going to happen here in Milwaukee? Like, how many of these guys they can be able to retain, and how do they pivot? Because, they still have Giannis Antetokounmpo, and I would imagine that they don't feel as though they have a winner around him if they end up losing a couple of those pieces.
Yeah, I do need to make a couple more calls on the Bucks ancillary guys because I'd heard nothing about Jay Crowder, for example, and then yesterday there was a couple of Jay Crowder could go here, Jay Crowder could go there. So, but with the big ticket numbers, the big ticket guys like Chris Middleton, I do expect to go back. Brook, I think, is a little bit more of a question of he does seem to be being tugged and pulled in both directions of of Houston, and sticking around in Milwaukee. And the numbers with him and the contract details with him are kind of similar. I expect he'll end up being thrown like another 2-year balloon contract from Houston. That seems to be their plan, like to give these kind of massive short-term balloon numbers that can make a player's eyes bulge and potentially, have the rival team that's trying to retain or sign that player kind of balk at that number figure.
Is there a team this week, as we right before we actually head into this, that you think has an added amount of pressure to make something happen that you're really watching when it comes to the trade market?
Added amount of pressure. I mean, the pressure, I think, is on any team that fell short that thinks they still have a shot in this wide-open league. So, I mean, do the Sixers have something creative up their sleeve to add a little bit more to this group, not just bringing back James Harden? And there's certainly their fan base and that whole city is very eager to see something happen after the team did not acquire a draft pick and just signed a couple of two-way guys. I mean, Miami, I think they're in an interesting spot, being that they obviously overachieved by incredible, accounts to make the finals out of the play-in tournament. They're the Damian Lillard, destination. But what if Dame doesn't request out? What if the Heat just end up having to look back at this offseason and their biggest decisions are re-signing Gabe Vincent and Max Strus, which could become very difficult. Depending on what those guys can elicit elsewhere. And it'd be a tough look for the Heat to make this finals run, have all this momentum, think they could get Damian Lillard, and then they don't get Dame and lose one of those two key starters for their finals run. That'd be a tough pill to swallow, I think.
Yeah, Miami was one of the three for me. I just looked at them and said, them in Sacramento, it feels like you got to do something, right? Like you're going to have to shake something up one way or another.
I don't think the Kings have pressure though, because the Kings are playing with half money, man. Like they made the playoffs for the first time in almost 2 decades. They're going to have $25 million in space. I think they are going to be a big player here. I don't know exactly who their target is. I'll leave a tease in that there's a couple of options I'm going to list in my next story that comes out today. But after renegotiating and extending Domantas Sabonis, they're going to have upwards of $25 million still to make a play. So could that be, a massive marquee guy here in this summer? Potentially, they're going to have just as good a chance as any good team to really improve here.
Read Jake's latest today. It's going to go up. Yahoo, senior NBA reporter for Yahoo Sports, Jake Fischer. Always appreciate the time, man. Thanks for coming on today.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
Take care. There goes Jake Fischer.